Hey, this is Hank with the Author Stories Podcast. Before we get into this week's episode, I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for the great turnout that we had for the Mulligan launch party. And we had a fantastic launch. And I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you. And if you haven't picked up a copy yet, it's available on my Third Scribe site, hankgarner.thirdscribe.com. There's links there to all of the places where you can buy it. And also this week, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Third Scribe, for sponsoring the show. Third Scribe is a place where authors can connect with readers, and authors can have a full blogging platform, bookstore. It takes care of all the things that an author needs to get their work and everything that they do out in front of readers. And it also allows readers to connect with the authors that they love. So check out thirdscribe.com. Also, you've heard us talk a lot about it, but it's finally here. Apocalypse Weird launches this month, February 23rd, with 5 books launching in one day. It's going to be incredible. Nothing like this has ever been done in indie publishing, and it's going to be something for readers to love, for you to collect, for you to get involved with and see this ever-growing universe. And it's going to be phenomenal. So I hope you'll join us. Go to apocalypseweird.com and sign up today so that you can be on the mailing list to get all of the new information as it comes out daily. apocalypseweird.com. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. This week, my very special guest is author of Nighthawks at the Mission, Forbes West. Welcome to the show, Forbes.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me on. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Just to give everyone a little heads up, Forbes and I have tried to record this once already, and we had some technical difficulties, so we're doing it again, and I hope that the end product will be better for it.
Second time's the charm. I think we'll be better next time.
That's right. That's right. Well, Forbes, I always start off my podcast by asking my guest to give us a little background about how they became a writer and what their motivation was. So tell us a little bit about you and your history as a writer.
Well, pretty much. I mean, I started kind of messing around with writing about 2001. I was in college at the time, and I was pretty much as a kind of a political radical. I was doing a lot of things with environmentalist groups and stuff like that at Cal State Long Beach, and so I was pretty heavily invested into it. And I was just kind of talking with my wife about it. You know, I wanted to kind of get deeper into politics, and you know, after a while, it was kind of burning me out. I mean, it was a little bit kind of soul-searing. Pretty much, you would have, you know, it's kind of like I think I said last time. It's kind of like going through like, you know, there's a very dry desert by yourself, and I think only the most sociopathic really can get to the other side. And I was just getting more and more burnt about it. I was studying for a political science degree. I've got a bachelor's degree, and then I also was going for my master's degree in political science. And so as more time kind of went, I just realized that, you know, I'm not enjoying this too much. I mean, I don't want to be part of some kind of a, you know, political machine on either side of the spectrum. So me and my wife were talking, and, you know, I hadn't messed around with writing before, and she was like, you know what, that's, you know, something I think you enjoy a lot more. I think you actually get more of a kick out of that. She was my girlfriend at the time, so I was like, you know what, I'll take a shot at this. And, yeah, I started to mess around with screenwriting at first. I was kind of thinking more along movies. I'm not a literature person by any means. I'm not a very heavy, how do you say, you know, into the classics or anything like that, so I'm more interested in films and movies. I mean, I kind of just, you know, I soak it up. I soak up quotes, you know, the themes, imagery, and all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to be a screenwriter. But then as I was learning that kind of craft, it was becoming apparent that as, you know, time was going on, that I felt kind of constricted because it's, you know, there's certain things you can and cannot do with screenwriting as opposed to what you can do with, like, say, a novel.
Right.
And so I decided to practice screenwriting for a bit, and I got into novels more and more. And, you know, the first screenwriting drafts are just awful. And same thing with the first novel was just awful. But it was just kind of like training for a marathon. I just kind of did it more and more, and it seemed like, again, I was getting better at it. And just about last year, well, actually, no, about 2013, I self-published on Amazon, and then I got picked up by what was called GMTA Publishing, which switched over to Ravenswood, and that's the ones who were nice enough to do Nighthawks at the Mission.
Awesome. So What was the frustration for you in screenwriting? I've talked with Stefan Boltz in the past, who also has dabbled in screenwriting, and Nick Cole has also talked about being a frustrated actor, and there being a lot of frustrated actors who turn to writing because they have a broader palette to use, I guess, when expressing themselves. But what for you was the constriction with screenwriting that was so much more freeing in fiction writing?
Well, I think the big thing is that when you're screenwriting, you have to do everything on such a visual plane that you can't really, get too down into the depths of your character's motivations and the actual kind of what's going on inside of them. I think that's more interesting in novels because you can actually feel like you're exactly a part of this person's story as opposed to just seeing this person's story played out. And I think that was one of the biggest things about that I really like to kind of actually, involve myself more with the characters and actually see how they actually, again, what they're feeling, what their emotions are going through. And that's something I think that, is more interesting on a novel scale. With film, too, one of the things I was realizing as well, and I'm sure this is the same thing with Nick, too, is that as an actor that, in your screenwriting, you basically you write up a screenplay and you give it to a director or producer, and then they can kind of mess with it any way they want to. So you don't have that kind of creative control 100%. And that's not exactly a bad thing. A lot of times if you collaborate with other people, it brings out much more. I mean, I did, I wrote and produced a couple short films in like the last year. One was Evil, which was kind of like a sex comedy, and then the other one was On the Border, which is a Western, which we just got done with the first screening of it, of the movie over at UCLA. And working with a director really does, it's a mixed bag. I mean, sometimes, again, it's, if you got a good guy like I had the last couple of times, I mean, it's fantastic. But I think, if I was just trying to just come out of nowhere and try to break into Hollywood and just, give over my screenplay and like, look, here you go, it'd be so tweaked to hell I wouldn't even recognize it. And I think with a novel, you get so much more creative control. Plus, again, that factor of actually, showing another dimension to the characters you can't possibly do with the screenplay or with, with the film itself.
Gotcha. So when you decided to pursue novel writing, the first book was Nighthawks at the Mission. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah. Nighthawks at the Mission.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about the premise of the book and how the idea for it came about.
Well, the premise of the book pretty much was that you have a young woman who lives in basically our kind of reality. It's just basically she lives in Southern California, and she basically gets screwed over by her boyfriend. He's a cheating POS, and she finds out about that. So she doesn't have really too much of a good home life. Her mother's, antagonistic and pretty much useless to her. So she doesn't really have a future. And, the economy is kind of like the economy of today. There's not really too much opportunity as there used to be. Everything's kind of locked up, especially for people in a certain age bracket. And, however, in this reality that she lives in, there's quite a difference. There's actually a portal in the South Pacific that opens up every solstice where people can actually go through the portal and go to this other planet called the Oberon. And Americans are going there because, again, they want to find opportunity, just like in the days of old. And this place is pretty much a mixed bag of like Lord of the Rings type imagery and country, mixing with also a science fiction element where, again, there's these large dead cities that have been abandoned for thousands of years that are teeming with high technology that, is not seen anywhere else on the earth. So she goes over there to become a simple settler. She gets a bit mixed up after a while with some petty criminals, and she, has to face down with basically is a growing terrorist threat of people in the Oberon who want to kick all the humans and the Americans out and actually keep the Oberon the way it was before we actually had the ability to go through that portal in the South Pacific and start settling and colonizing the lands. And so there's a few themes with the book itself. I mean, one is this the colonialism, just that, again, that the interaction between the settler and the indigenous people that's been played out for, hundreds of years all across the planet. And then also, too, it's a deconstruction of young adult novels as well. I wanted to show the actual reality of actually having a very young woman who's 20 years old actually end up in such an environment that's so dangerous and so stressful. I wanted to show the actual how, the character would actually react to these events. So it's actually more of a character study than most, Hunger Games or Harry Potter books actually were doing. I wanted to take, again, the young adult ideal and then just kind of deconstruct it and just kind of tear it apart.
Was there something about the typical young adult fare that's out there now that resonated with you that you thought, oh, I need to do this because what's going on out there is just not working? Like, was there something that jumped out at you that made you say, oh, I'm going to take this on?
I think the main thing was, and I got this from the Hunger Games and then also from Harry Potter too, and then Twilight, which I never read. I didn't know the story, but I just refused to read that. But when it comes to that kind of thing, I just noticed that every one of the characters, for the most part, I mean, they might have some kind of personal problems or some damage about what happened to them over the course of events, but they never really touch upon it. They don't want to get too deep. And I also wanted to show that such a character would actually make bad, poor decisions at the same time, would actually act with pretty poor motives a lot of the time too, based on being immature, being so young, and also being just completely stressed out because of the adventure they're involved in. So I wanted to kind of focus on that more. Most of the time, all the characters on these stories usually act with the best intentions. They usually don't make dreadful mistakes, and they usually don't have a litany of personal problems that just adds up. And I wanted to showcase that more because I think that when we go through history and we look back at heroes and politicians and things like that, the people that help craft and shape our society, a lot of our heroes are very complicated, very dark individuals with again at times with very poor decision making experiences that they do. So I think I wanted to kind of showcase that a bit more, and I can think of tons of examples of history where that's been the case, even with the people we would always think of as true American or true global heroes.
Well, yeah, our view of history is always distorted through the lens of whatever is popular at the moment, or for whatever reason. But that's fascinating to look at the human condition and kind of deconstruct those noble deeds and things like that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think what Hemingway was always talking about, how you're supposed to always kind of just write one true sentence or one make the story as true as you possibly can. Of course, it sounds silly when you're talking about fiction because obviously none of it's true, but in a way, I want to always get to that reality of like, truthfully, this is how it would actually play out more so than anything else. And I think that again, with history, we always get the cleaned up versions for the most part in our schools, for various reasons. And again, I think it's more interesting, especially for a young adult person to really just be like, hey, you know what? This is actually how it kind of, came about. This is exactly how the person was. I mean, we hear all these kind of stories all the time, like for, like Civil War heroes, for example, like, Ulysses S. Grant was, practically a fall down drunk. You talk about Churchill and his drinking problems, his battles with depression, some of the kind of more, asinine decision making that some of the heroes actually in history had made, the things that they actually embarked upon, for example, it had to be done, but like my wife is Japanese, and one of the biggest things that happened in Japan besides the nuclear bombings was the fire bombings of major cities with napalm. And that's, again, it had to be done to kind of finish off the war as quickly as they could without so much catastrophic loss of life, especially on both sides even. But it's still, it's an ugly thing, and these people that we think of as heroes, decided to sign off on that. And I wanted to show that kind of particular reality of life. Right.
And a lot of times those decisions, which ultimately turn out good, and that's such a shallow way of looking at it, but they're usually met with a lot of conflicting feelings and conflicted morality, I would imagine.
Yeah, and it's just, again, I think that especially when it comes to young adult novels, you don't see that kind of conflict. You don't really see that kind of personal, moral choices usually, again, like we would do one thing or the other, or try to, basically kind of choose the lesser of two evils. I mean, like, I always thought it was kind of funny, for example, I mean, this might just crazy way of looking at it, but like in Harry Potter throughout the series, I think it's about the fifth book where you got Order of the Phoenix, and they already know that, Voldemort's coming, and they already know who a lot of Voldemort's allies are. It's like the Malfoys and all these other kind of families that are going to back Voldemort's rise to power again. But it's funny to me that they never take any real aggressive action against it, and I don't think that's the reality. I think that people, if they know certain people are enemies, they know they're behind certain actions, they're not going to sit for the bad guy just to come at them. They're going to do certain things, and a lot of those things they're going to do is going to come up pretty nasty. They're going to preemptively strike, and a lot of times they might have, collateral damage at the same time. I'm just surprised that, again, when it comes to young adult books, and authors never think about that kind of possibility.
True. You said that it was has a mixture of like a fantasy and sci-fi setting. Are you a big fantasy and sci-fi fan?
A fan of science fiction and fantasy?
Yes.
Yes, no, definitely. I think it's fun because it gives you, especially when you're talking about like character types, it just gives you so much more room to just have it a more imaginative and kind of fun way to kind of explore issues. I mean, I think that we had some kind of book that was just a very dried, cut and dried kind of story about modern life. I don't think it would be nearly as interesting and as fun. And I think that's part of the reading experience, is to have some enjoyment. I mean, part of it is entertainment. You should have some fun seeing this. So you should be like, wow, that is a cool idea, or that I didn't see that coming, or that's an interesting setting. I think that's an important integral part of the entire reading experience. Sometimes when you're trying to go towards having like, a very realistic book or something that's very truthful, sometimes you're going to drain away anything that was really kind of entertaining and fun for the reader, and that should always be, maintained. I mean, readers don't want to be getting into books left and right just for these political parables that just keep being spewed out. They don't want to be hit over the head over and over again. They want to have some fun with it at the same time. And then in the second or third reading, when they go back to the book again, or the novel, or the movie or whatever, and they see more elements to it, I think that just adds to the reader's experience. I think that's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's always been this weird divide with science fiction and fantasy, even though they get lumped together in genre and in bookstores. But there's tend to be people that are very there's a line drawn down the middle, and I'm a fantasy fan or I'm a sci-fi fan. Mm-hmm. And you use kind of tropes of both of those. Is there a reason for that, or are you just trying to kind of craft everything that you love and put it into the story, or kind of what's your thought process behind that?
Well, my thought process is that, science fiction and fantasy can be, kind of, they can kind of merge together easily, because I think it was Arthur C. Clarke used to talk about how technology, after a certain point, if you didn't really know anything about how it worked, is basically magic. And I believe that pretty much. I think that, again, that when you have a certain high levels of technology, especially some of the stuff we use nowadays, and you don't have any kind of deep computer engineering degree or any kind of, real idea of how they work, they basically, for all intents and purposes, must be magic. I mean, like, with our router issues, our internet connections, or again, how computers are. I mean, for the most part, the lay person, it's basically a magical device. We really don't know how this thing actually works. And if you ask people on the street about how it's going to work, most of the time they're not going to know.
That's right.
And I think that's the reason why you can easily kind of push the two together, because I think, honestly, my book is more science fiction-like, but it's based on that premise that, again, the technology that they're encountering and using is so well and above and beyond their understanding that for all intents and purposes, it must be magic. And I think that, they have a clear divide between the two. It's like, well, I don't think that actually can exist. I mean, it's, again, you can explain certain things in very much science fiction terms, like, what is it? Like a movie like, Interstellar, for example. That's pretty much rooted in, traditional science fiction. Yeah, that can be like that, but anything that, has to do with any kind of higher technologies that's way beyond our scope of perception, it might as well be fantasy. So I don't see there's a real difference between the two.
Well, speaking of Interstellar, if you don't know what Interstellar is, then you've been under a rock for all summer and fall. But, with the release of that movie, they also put out a lot of little short documentary features about the science behind Interstellar and a lot of the making of, and they had all these astrophysicists and the like talking about it and talking about how important it was for them to get that right. What do you think of that? Do you think that our science fiction needs to be so rigid that we have to be able to nail down every concept to make it, worthy art?
No, I don't think that at all. I mean, it's interesting, though. I think it's very important, especially since I do think, the more hard science fiction movies out there really do kind of, push, the interested in people into those kind of science fields. I mean, you kind of hear those stories about how Star Trek, people got interested in, aeronautics and astronautics and going out into space and everything like that. They got interested because of Star Trek. I think that's the point. They always kind of maintain that kind of connection between certain parts of science fiction and science reality. I think it's interesting for people, too, to know about that. And I think that that should be always maintained. I think there should always be that kind of like element with it because it becomes of interest, and then, it kind of spurs people to have, a way of like, well, maybe we can turn this into reality. I hear about like, or actually just think about back in like the 60s when they were showing like the communicators for the original Star Trek series. That's basically cell phones nowadays. I'm sure that there was some inspiration from that series into the development of cell phones. I mean, there's even talk about a guy who's developing, what would be almost like a warp drive. And I think he was inspired by, again, science fiction and Star Trek. And I think the guy even mentioned that too. I'm not sure, but I think that was kind of one of his points as well.
In Nighthawks at the mission, you say that the portal that leads to the other world is in the South Pacific. Did you choose the South Pacific for any particular reason?
Yes, I did actually. There's it's called Point Nemo in the South Pacific, and it's basically the point furthest away from any landmass. So this is the furthest out you can get to the ocean without being anywhere close to any particular continent like Australia or like the Americas. So again, it's deepest part of the ocean. Well, not the deepest part, but like the furthest away from any kind of landmass, and so it's so isolated.
The most remote location.
Yeah, it's like the most remote location possible. And I got the inspiration from just hearing the name Point Nemo. I thought that was interesting. And then also too, Point Nemo was the supposed resting place of Cthulhu from the H.P. Lovecraft series. And H.P. Lovecraft had it that the city that Cthulhu sleeps in is at Point Nemo, that the coordinates for that city is actually at Point Nemo as well. So I thought, again, this would tie that into, again, Lovecraft imagery that, again, this furthest point away from everything else. That's, I thought that would be very cool to have. And that's where I got the inspiration from again, Lovecraft and then just the, what they call Point Nemo.
Are you a big Lovecraft fan?
Absolutely. I love Lovecraft because Lovecraft was always really good about setting up this kind of universe and reality where there were so many different layers to it that you had no full understanding of what you were experiencing. And it was like beyond perception. And that's why most of the time his characters always end up going insane and ripping out their own eyes or something like that because it was just layer upon layer and that there was this, it just made the universe seem so large and so surreal and weird and strange that, it was beyond our perception. I think that's a very cool concept to get with because that makes it, that any time you're dealing with that sort of reality it makes it more ominous. It makes it mostly kind of existential kind of horror, like something deeper than just some maniac running around with a knife trying to, slash you to pieces. I mean, it's something that can, rip apart your very soul. And I mean, it's a very deep concept. And I just think that existential horror that, Lovecraft was hinting at in his stories and, different planes of reality is, again, much more interesting than this run-of-the-mill monster tale.
Yeah, and the tendency in horror now seems to be that, just push out as much blood and guts and in-your-face grossness as you can, and that's considered horror now. And Lovecraft, he wrote stuff that would, make you scared to turn the light off at night because the subtlety of what you didn't know and what you didn't understand was way more terrifying.
Yeah, it's kind of with the less is more idea. I mean, you had the again, it's just that you only got kind of like a peek at the iceberg of, ominous monster horror that was there. I mean, it's just like you really didn't know how deep this thing went. And I think that was the cool thing that Lovecraft was always able to push out in his stories. That there's this planes of existence, and there's, realities we don't know about, and these creatures beyond space and time. I mean, these are all very heavy concepts. I just think that, lazy writers just like to do these things where it's like, oh, we just, it's something crazy is going to happen, and there's going to be a person running around chopping up people, and there's going to be blood and guts and gore, and that's, gross and crazy, and that's just, that's really nothing. And to really feel like, again, that you might be stuck in a universe that's completely illogical and just completely mad, I think that's much more horrific than, just seeing a bunch of this guts and intestines and blood and splatter all over the place.
Right. Tell us about your follow-up, Once Upon a Time in Temecula. What's that about?
Well, that is the start of a series I'm calling TK, and that's basically set in the same universe as Nighthawks at the Mission. It's the same exact setting. It's just a different characters, a different location within the same exact overall story. And that's about a young guy who his father is just pretty much lost the family business, which was a winery in Temecula. And so this character's pushed to desperation to basically make the big move off-world to the Oberon. And he gets convinced by a friend of his who's already well set up, who's already made a ton of money in the Oberon, and so he figures it's a good deal. And he goes over to the Oberon, and he finds out the friend who's talked up the place so much is dead, and he's pretty much stuck and dead in the water and trying to figure out his, where he's going to take his life now, even though he's made this big commitment to this new place. So it's a little bit more... it's different from Nighthawks, where Nighthawks deals more with kind of like this whole grand epic scale of what this, the relationship between human beings and the indigenous and what's going on in the Oberon. This is more like the everyday world of the Oberon. This is just like, again, just a regular schmo who's kind of just like stuck in a bad situation trying to make a life for himself on this other planet.
And you say...
being like this.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's like, Nighthawks and Mission would be more the epic. This would be more about what everyday life would be in such a strange place.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And you said this is first in a series. How big and in scope do you think this will be?
Well, I'm trying to do it to get at least like about 10 to 12 more of these kind of like short stories. It's an episodic kind of like serial novel, so I'm trying to get 10 to 12 more of these short stories put together. I put it on hiatus at the moment just because I'm working, again, I was doing like the short films. I'm also working on more of a feature project that I can't go into details about, but that is something else I'm doing at the same time. Plus also, what we're doing together, Apocalypse Weird, is, again, I think a priority. I really think it's such a great idea that, again, that I switch gears and to write the Medium Talent, which will be part of the Apocalypse Weird grouping along with you.
Awesome.
And the others too.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute, but I want to ask you about this universe that you've created for Nighthawks and for Temecula, and what do you, some people will create a world and set a novel or maybe a trilogy there, and then completely abandon it and move on to another project. What do you think is what benefit, and that's not a good word, but how does this big world building, where you create this place and you set multiple stories in there, do you think readers are more engaged when they can come to a story and have a sense of familiarity there?
I think so too. It's like they basically don't have to relearn everything. It's one
right.
of the weakest parts, I think, of like any kind of like say like a superhero film, or like like the Marvel films, for instance, or even like a Batman. Like some of the weakest parts. I should take back Batman. Batman, the series with Christian Bale, that was actually pretty well done. But most of the time, an origin story, like setting up all the particularities of the world, is usually the slowest and kind of not as well done part, is actually really launching into the story. So I think if you already have a really big sandbox to begin with, and you already kind of know the particulars about it, and, you know, you can go back there again and again. I think that's extremely interesting for the reader because, again, you know, they're basically already kind of invested and already want to be a part of this world, and they do this can enjoy it instead of just having this, you know, kind of restart every time. I think it's, you know, one of the things is that sometimes books in science fiction kind of preemptively, you know, blow up their own world that they were in, and it's kind of like they lose something by it. I thought that, I always thought this, for instance, like with Frank Herbert's Dune, the first Dune book sets up this whole thing about, you know, basically the Middle Ages in space, and they have such a grand idea of, like, you know, the different houses and the royal families that rule these planets and the emperor and everything like that, and how this whole universe works. And pretty much by the end of that first novel, that's all done away with and not even really talked about. And I always thought that would be interesting. They actually kept playing with that more and more. I mean, they moved beyond it really quickly after the first novel, and I always thought that was kind of a lot, especially when the first Dune novel comes with its own glossary of so many different facts and figures and all sorts of stuff of what's going on in that particular universe at that time. I thought that was just kind of a waste. And I think it's, you know, it's interesting to go back to that again and again. I think that's one of the successes of Harry Potter, too, is that she does maintain such a grand universe and people just love it, and they can almost vicariously just see themselves being a part of it. And I think that's an awesome thing to do. And I think world building is something that should be really, you know, touched upon.
Absolutely. And as a writer, what benefit is it to you to sit down and to begin a new story and already have continuity to pull from, already have, you know, cultural idioms and things like that already in place? You know, how does that benefit a writer to have a continuing universe to work with?
I think it's a great benefit to a writer because I think that, you know, if you want to have something that's interesting and unique, I think you have to have a very cool world to begin with it. And once you have that, it becomes very easy to kind of plug in stories into place. I mean, that's why I think it's such a big thing when you see or you hear about fan fiction with, like, Star Trek or Star Wars. You know, they already have an established universe to draw from all these stories. So they have, like, you know, so much tools to use to craft your own story to begin with that, again, I think they can really explore different options very quickly. I think that world building is the hardest part to get right. And once you have that down, you can really just go nuts and explore so many different ways of how this universe works and how these characters work and how they interact. I think it'd be, you know, it behooves the writer to kind of do that, to set that up to begin with. And, you know, if they already have some kind of universe they already operate upon, that, you know, I think it makes it, again, something fun and interesting for the author, and then something fun and interesting for the audience, because they already kind of know what the author's coming from. They already kind of know the particulars of what the universe is.
That's right. And, you know, some writing advice that you'll hear from successful authors a lot is that you should set out to write a series and there's a lot of good logic behind that, I guess, that, you know, when a reader, if a story really resonates with a reader, when they get to the end of it, they're going to want to find out what the next chapter in that story is, or, you know, or hunt down the next thing from that author. And if they can immediately transition into a new story that has that same comfortable feeling, and they already know the settings and some of the characters, or at least some of you kind of expect some character traits and things like that, it just enhances that immersive experience for the reader.
It does. I think, you know, it's nice for the continuation. It's kind of like, you know, it's like the reader knows they're kind of how to say, it's like, you know, they already liked it to begin with, that first one. It's like they're kind of going back to a safe place. So, I mean, you know, because it is an investment to actually read, like, you know, such a long novel. You get anywhere from like 70,000 to 120,000 words. You know, that's some time and effort involved, and especially with the busy lives we all lead. You know, you want to kind of know halfway what are you getting into. I think it's, again, it's good for an author to kind of start out with a series idea and really kind of develop upon that, because, again, you know, once you kind of have a feeling, it's kind of like you're building your own brand, I would suspect. So I think that's a very good idea to be doing it like that. I think that, you know, having that just makes it more interesting too, because, again, there could be callbacks to earlier parts of the stories. There could be characters that didn't seem to be a real, you know, particular any particular interest in the beginning parts of one book, and now all of a sudden like major players in the other books. And I think that's kind of cool to go back and forth, especially for people who like to reread books, especially like I do. I think that's one of the strongest parts of television is that, when you watch some of these long series like The Sopranos or Breaking Bad, Sopranos was actually pretty good about this too. Sopranos would have these minor characters that, in the earlier seasons you could see in the background that were just kind of like, either the butts of jokes or just, not really of any importance. All of a sudden they become much more integral to the story. And I think that's kind of a neat thing to see, especially when you kind of rewatch and go back and forth. So, if you have the same kind of concept with books, I think that makes it a very cool thing as well, because it's just like, oh, so that's where that person came from. We're like, oh, I remember this, or I remember that setting.
That's right. And that whole concept on a grand scale is Apocalypse Weird, or what we hope to be. And
yes.
you and I both are involved in Apocalypse Weird. And for anyone who has not listened to the other half dozen podcasts I've done with Apocalypse Weird authors where we've talked about it, this is a large universe where a bunch of different authors are coming together to each destroy their own favorite part of the world. And and I hope I know a lot of us, or all of us, are taking great pains to try to work with one another to embed things in our stories that link our universes together, in fun ways and ways that will enhance the experience for the reader. Tell us a little bit about your project in Apocalypse Weird.
Well, Medium Talent is a book that I set my part of the world to get blown up is pretty much the Florida Keys and Key West. And my book is about a young woman who is in Key West. She's a boat captain. And the best way to describe it is it's kind of a weird hybrid of The Have or Have Not, the Hemingway novel, and then also George A. Romero's Land is Dead. And the first few minutes of Land is Dead, because that movie turns to crap really fast, but the overall idea of Land is Dead, where it's like you pretty much have this real dichotomy between the rich and the poor, and that, you have these people who go out to try to salvage and maintain this little zone that's, free of the zombie epidemic. I really did like that concept, but then I combined it with, The Have or Have Not with Hemingway, which is about, again, the lifestyle of the kind of smuggler captain, halfway in and out of the law, who's trying to make a living to support his family. I kind of applied that to my character, Wendy, who is, a young boat captain in Key West who's trying to maintain her own family, from basically starving to death in this new and blown out world where a great storm has ravaged the entire planet, and there's a zombie epidemic that has pretty much decimated the survivors. So, the federal government's still operating with this supply organization that kind of runs everything, but everything's just kind of falling apart little by little, and she's just trying to maintain. And she finds out some pretty dark secrets of her own past and what has to do with the apocalypse that had occurred about 3 years prior to the story beginning.
Gotcha. Why did you choose Key West?
I went down to Key West for my 30th birthday. It was kind of a twofer. Me and my friend went to Miami for a couple of days, and then we drove to the Florida Keys, and last stop is Key West. And when I was in Key West, I was just fascinated with the place because it's a very different kind of place. It's one half touristy and then one half kind of style, especially with the arts. It's a weird marriage between kind of a redneck culture and like a hippie culture kind of intermingling. There's you find these kind of facets, that they're just, side by side, and it just goes back and forth. And one part of town will be this overly touristy and overly, every kind of tourist hell you can possibly imagine. And the other part of town is this kind of laid back, do whatever you want, man, kind of feeling. And then it's right on the water. It's beautiful. It's always, usually about in the 70s every day. You got these wide blue skies all around it, and, it's only about 90 miles away from Cuba, which is basically, a stone's throw away. They always have these signs all over the place saying it's closer to Cuba than it is to a Walmart, So, it's got this unique feel. And it's a very small town. It's really not that big. It's only about I think about 25,000 people altogether.
Yeah.
And, you can walk from one point to the other, within like an hour or so. It's not that big at all. So I just thought it was a very interesting setting. Plus, there's a big Hemingway connection there too, because he did most of his productive works. His Hemingway's house is there, and that's a big tourist attraction too. So I like just to integrate all that. And I thought, to have not, that was an interesting story, because that was pretty much the only novel of Hemingway's that was actually set in his hometown. He was in Key West, I think, from 1930 to about 1940, pretty much. He was down there, again, he was pretty much like at the height of his, productive powers, because he pumped out a lot of stuff, short stories mostly, and then, again, that was his kind of base, and you see Hemingway's face all over the place. I mean, that's one of the biggest things they push in that time. You take 2 steps, you're tripping over a Hemingway something. So I thought that would be interesting to integrate into the story, because I wanted to kind of take my story in a slightly different direction, where it's kind of, again, there's apocalypse and post-apocalypse, but also have kind of like a noir setting to it. So I wanted to have that kind of thing.
Gotcha. And tell us about your hero. Can you give us a little insight into your protagonist?
Sorry, can you repeat that? You kind of cut out for a second.
Can you tell us a little bit about your hero, your protagonist in medium talent?
Yeah, well, it's Wendy Wicker, and she's, again, the boat captain, and she's someone who's had to grow up very, very fast, because the world is basically, for all intents and purposes, has ended. And she's this one that has, very much a dark side that she knows and is trying to control. And again, she has her boat, and some of the things that she thinks about her own past and her own reality is not exactly the truth. So I'll just leave it at that. She just pretty much is kind of under a delusion, and at the same time, she's trying to do the right thing always, but there's this, it's the nasty world, and certain things kind of crop up.
Yeah. So are there some similar themes to Nighthawks?
There is. There's a similar theme of just pretty much just the good person trying to do the right thing, but things kind of turn to a mess.
Yeah.
I would say that was one part of it. And I also just like to have, again, female protagonists, because I think it's more interesting that way. I think you have kind of a deluge of the strong male characters running around left and right, and I think that's just it's just overdone, not because of any political statement or anything like that. I just think it's more interesting to have a female protagonist who has to adapt to these events, and I think it's more interesting from her perspective about what's going on. I think it's just something different. So that's probably the two major things about that. Is just, again, a woman involved in very terrible things, and then also trying to do the right thing, but it never works out, really. It just always kind of turns into kind of a darker path.
Sure. Forbes, I always like to ask people about their creative process, and do you have any sort of routine that you go through when you write? Some people have to be in a particular spot for the muse to visit, or have to have a candle burning or whatever. Do you have any odd rituals when you write?
Well, I gotta say that, marijuana helps out a lot. That's something that's a little unsung hero. That's a thing where you can't write on that stuff with so don't try it. But I mean, it does open up some creative levels. It really does make you kind of just think up certain things that kind of hook your creativity around the corner. That'd be one thing. The other thing would be too is just I also go on YouTube a lot, and I try to I think up themes of from movies and television, and I try to see, I get inspiration from them. YouTube's very good for having these little 2-second clips that are, 2-minute clips of certain scenes from movies, and I kind of get inspiration from that. And I spend some time trying to work myself up into an emotional mood for how to produce a certain scene, and I think that's something that's that seems to help a lot. Again, the ability to recall and look at, it's scene from The Godfather, a scene from Breaking Bad, or a scene from this and that, and I get inspiration from that because I can get a certain feel of what I want and make it my own afterwards. So it's a lot of surfing with YouTube, and then there's also just a lot of pretty much spending some time jotting down notes a lot of it, and a lot of stuff doesn't even end up on the printed page at all. So I think a lot of note taking just to make sure that I can really kind of find a way to again, just, jot down as many ideas as I can. And most of the time, 90% of them won't even end up on the final printed page, but it's just that it's good for a lot of brainstorming. So I have to always do, one stage of note-taking, brainstorming, research. Then I can switch on to the actual writing part of it.
Yeah. Do you have a certain time of day that's more creative for you?
Yeah, so the evening time, that seems to be pretty good when it comes to brainstorming new things. Like I do like to write in the mornings, actual like the sitting down to actually write part. I like to do that more in the morning, but the evening time, that seems where it's like a little bit more of a creativity kind of gets generated.
Gotcha.
Just because I'm a little bit more of a night owl too, and I think it's just that then just, my subconsciousness is kind of like etching into my consciousness after that point.
Sweet. Well, Forbes West, where can people find you on the web to follow what you're doing and to keep up with all your shenanigans and to get news about upcoming projects and things like that?
Well, pretty much I have a good website that's been done by Robert McKellen and the good people over at ThirdScribe. So it's offworldnetwork.thirdscribe.com. That is the one, again, that has most of my information onto that. I also, again, have Twitter, Forbes West, Facebook, Forbes West, too. I'm always mentioning updates on that. But, Offworld Network, ThirdScribe, again, Bembo in. That's pretty much, again, my website, and that has all the details, again, what I'm doing with writing when it comes, again, to the books, and then also when it comes to, again, some of the short film projects and film projects I'm working on right now.
Yeah, that was going to be the next thing was, can we follow your film projects at the same place, or do you have those segmented?
Those, pretty much it just has like updates about that. Pretty much I don't have any of the films online as of yet. The reason being is that we are trying to go through the film festivals at the moment.
Yeah.
And so there is certain places, for example, that if you put out your movie out onto the web itself, it does disqualify you for getting to a film festival. But those will be coming up soon. Hopefully, there's kind of a thing, SureTheWeek.com, we're hopefully trying to get one of them onto there. And if that happens, then I'll definitely throw out the link for that one too.
Awesome. Well, Forbes, thanks so much for coming on the show again and helping me get this recorded. And I'll put links to all your stuff in the show notes. And I wish you much success, and we'll see you around the apocalypse.
Yeah, great. Sounds good. We'll see you around the apocalypse too. Thanks a lot, Hank. The pleasure's all mine. It was a lot of fun. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.